Hi, everyone. Yeah, we got a number of items coming up next month on April 20th. Our next topic is going to be about Bay Area dredging, and we'll have a speaker from the Army Corps of Engineers and from Arcadia to talk about that. So that's interesting environmental and water topic. Then the following month in May, we have information on conjunctive uses of managing groundwater basins to meet both the interest of ag users and habitat management. So it's a harvest water, recycled water conjunctive use project that we'll be talking about. I think it's up in the Sacramento area. Very intriguing, something that the planning team has been very excited about. And we're glad we were able to get it into the hopper. And then we're looking a little later in the early summer of perhaps having another presentation on the Contra Costa refineries. We are hoping to look at the Marathon Petroleum Renewable Diesel project and how that will play out. And we've got 20 ideas laid out ahead on water and environmental issues. We're always looking for things that are timely. So certainly if somebody sees something that's particularly timely that you'd like to get into the rotation early on, let any one of the planning team members know, or any of the chairs or Lindy, and we'll see if we can shoehorn it in sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much, Dan. I just wanted to mention some quick EBLC updates. We do have a board meeting this Friday, and then actually earlier than that, tomorrow, we're doing an opportunity task force with the new president of Cal State East Bay and the new chancellor of the Contra Costa Community College District. So if you haven't had a chance to meet either of them, it's a great opportunity. They're going to be doing a short presentation and a little bit of a longer question and answer session. They'll also both be joining us as part of the East Bay Leadership Council board, which we're really excited about. So lots of changes in education here locally. St. Mary's is also getting a new head of its institution, a new president over there. So almost all of our education institutions have been bringing in new leadership locally here in the East Bay, or at least in Contra Costa County. I also just wanted to mention that we have an event coming up. It's going to be on the 25th. It's our East Bay Leadership Series. We're doing a series on women in the workplace with some people from McKinsey who were part of looking at some of the numbers about the reduction of women in the workforce as a result of COVID and what that might look like as we go forward. So if that's of interest, again, it's on the 25th. It's a lunchtime event. We'd love to have you there. Okay, and without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Pablo Garza. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly, Pablo?
Yeah, you got it. That's right.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here. We welcome you. This is the East Bay Leadership Council's Water and Environment Task Force. Pablo has spent more than 17 years working in and around the California State Legislature, and he is currently the Chief Consultant for the Committee on Water, Parks, and Wildlife in the Assembly. This is a return to the State Assembly for him. He began his career in public policy at the State Assembly and then moved on for a little bit, and now he's back. Prior to becoming the chief consultant, Pablo advocated on natural resources and water policies on behalf of the Environmental Defense Fund and as political director of its California Ecosystems Program. He was also the director of state policy and external affairs for the Nature Conservancy. He grew up here in California and he attended UC Davis, earned a BA in English, which we share. My bachelor's degree is in English as well. And after college, he worked in various jobs in Southern California and traveled around Mexico and then returned to UCLA. If Kristen was here, she'd be saying go Bruins. Our CEO is a UCLA grad and very proud, and she says hello to all of you. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here today. He completed an MA in Latin American Studies there while he was at UCLA, and today he's here with us. So thank you so much. I'm going to just hand it right over to you, Pablo, so you can go ahead and share your screen and take it over.
Great. Thank you, Lindy. And thanks for the invitation to come speak to you guys. And I'm glad to hear there's another UCLA alumni. This is an important time of the year with the NCAA tournament around the corner. Anyway, UCLA is kind of limping into it, so I'm disappointed about that, but hopefully they step it up.
We'll cheer for you.
Yeah. I'm going to share my presentation and then we can go through that. It's short and not anything too fancy, and then hopefully we can have a dialogue, or I can answer questions, or however we want to go. And I think I'll stop. I'm going to go cover kind of what the committee is, some of the big issues playing out in the legislature, kind of logistically this year, and then policy-wise. And I'll probably stop after each slide just to see if there's questions, or if not, we can just keep going. Let me make sure I do. Right, I know how to do this.
See your slide.
You see that? I might,
You can just leave it, yeah.
yeah, I think I'm gonna just leave it like that. If we go to, all right, so that's me. Sorry. You know, I have to say, I'm not a fan of Spring Forward, and so I'm just gonna attribute all that to Spring Forward. I'm still
like
adjusting. Oh wait, I need to. So yeah, that's me. So I was going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature. I think I'm dealing with a sophisticated audience, and you know the basics of state legislative process and policymaking. But just highlight, the assembly is the lower house of the state legislature. There's two houses. Our committee is one of three kind of natural resource environmental committees in the state assembly. There's also the Committee on Natural Resources, and Committee on Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials. And we kind of split the various environmental natural resource issues. And I appreciate, Lindy, that you had the pause between water and parks, because a lot of people call us up thinking we regulate like raging waters and these, water parks around the state. That's not, that I think that might be under a jurisdiction, but it's not exclusively what we do. It's water, pause, parks, and wildlife. And it's kind of what it sounds like. I think we split kind of the more urban retail kind of water supply side of things goes through the Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee more often than us. But we kind of think of the water and the water supply in the watershed as it flows through the rivers down to your faucet. Kind of we cover everything up to getting into the infrastructure and being delivered to your faucet. Parks is pretty self-explanatory. It's state parks and regional parks. And then wildlife is our fish and wildlife resources. The wildfire issues is actually covered by the Natural Resources Committee, as is kind of coastal sea level rise issues. But there's always some blurred lines between the jurisdictions. Our chair is Assemblymember Eduardo Garcia. He's from Coachella. Represents, I think it's the 56th district. I should have that off the top of my head. And he was elected in 2016. He's been chair, I think, since 2018, and has a history, working on kind of equity issues, climate issues, as well as natural resource bonds. And Lindy, as you mentioned, he ran a bill last year on creating a Lithium Commission to explore developing lithium in his district. Economic development is a really big issue in his district. It's historically, an ag-dominated economy and tourism-dominated economy. They're looking to develop other aspects of their economy. My role as staff is to, we review the bills in our issue area. We're a policy committee that, as the bills are introduced, they tend to come to us for their first stop to get a vetting. We write the analyses, we make recommendations to the chair, and ultimately, but it's the members who do the voting. I covered our jurisdiction. The bill hearings is what I was just talking about. We also do informational and oversight hearings. I think that's an important function of the legislature. It's kind of can be a lost art, I think. But I'm hoping now, in my new role, we can do more oversight, more informational hearings, as I think a lot can get done. You can pass the law, you can pass the bill, but it's important to make sure it's being implemented in the way that was intended. We just held an informational hearing on parks and open space and kind of how COVID impacted our parks and open space around the state. I think it was really an interesting hearing. I think anecdotally we've seen with the shutdown, kind of our parks and open spaces, one of the few spaces available that was open the last year, and sort of anecdotally had been hearing a lot of people flocking to the outside. I certainly observed that. And we heard from our state parks and some regional park representatives about kind of that's exactly what they're dealing with. So it's great to see people taking advantage of the resource, but it's also, there's a risk of loving it to death and kind of realizing keeping park staff safe, kind of making sure we have all the amenities. So anyway, I think we just held that a few weeks ago, and we're looking to do a drought informational hearing probably sometime in mid-May. Current challenges. So just COVID, this has been a crazy year for all of us. And the legislature was not exempt from that. They shut down and went on early recess last March. April is the busiest month for the legislature, and they basically lost all of April in terms of legislative process last year. So a lot of bills that were proposed or introduced just never even received their first hearing. The legislature did return in May, did some work on bills, and was able to get the budget done on time, and then went through the summer. But it was not a smooth. Let's just say it was not a smooth year. I was not in the legislature last year. I was outside, kind of observing it, but it was rocky. I think things are a lot better right now, but the staff are largely working remotely. I'm not sure. I think I have been in the Capitol. I started on December 1st. I've been in the Capitol once. I've been in my office 2 or 3 times. So we're still doing hearings, predominantly remotely. On the one hand, it's nice because we have increased access to the conversation, but I think something's lost when this is really an in-person kind of business, and when you're not seeing people face to face, and you definitely lose a lot. And then just note political polarization. I think we're all observing that. The Capitol, we saw what happened in DC, and kind of the fence, and kind of there's still a large National Guard contingent. We had a similar experience. We didn't have any challenges like they did in DC, but they basically shut down the Capitol on Inauguration Day, and around that week had a large fence around the Capitol, and I think something like 400 National Guardsmen and women deployed. So I think has come to, the fence is no longer there, the guard is no longer there in the state capitol, but it's still a concern. And I think, personally, I think it's really unfortunate that I think the Capitol is supposed to be the house for the public to come in and observe what's going on. And I think hopefully we can get past this and kind of balance the needs for security and access, because the public needs to be there to observe and engage in the policymaking process. And I personally feel like that's really important. And I know a couple of staff who were actually in the building that week of the presidential inauguration, and it sounded like it was just kind of eerie. There was a lot more guards, troops in the Capitol than there were staff. Hopefully we kind of get past that and turn that around. I don't know if there's any questions on this slide. I'll stop. If not, I can move on. Okay. And then so Gary sort of stole my thunder on this, but I think, this is looming large over us right now. The kind of image speaks for itself. Virtually, basically all of California is in at least abnormally dry, if not, moderate to severe drought. And I put the whole West here just because I think when you look at the Colorado River Basin, you just see, much of that is in extreme or exceptional drought, which is really kind of a frightening prospect. And I think, less so for, the Bay Area, but this is Colorado River is a really important water supply for Southern California. My boss's district included has kind of one of the largest allocations of Colorado River water in the 7 basins. And it's a really, it supplies a significant amount of water to urban Los Angeles and San Diego and Orange County every year. So this sort of situation where the Colorado River Basin's in they're talking about a mega drought, ultimately does have implications for all of California and Northern California. And I think it's important to keep that bigger picture in mind. We're not officially in drought yet. I think but the Department of Water Resources does its final snow survey on April 1st. And I think we'll have more, I wouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves in an official proclamation going forward. Like Gary said, the reservoirs are in decent shape. And I think Southern California particularly has a lot of water stored. So I think they'll be able to get through the next year without any really severe, without water rationing or severe cutbacks. But I think this issue of drought, it feels like we just got through the last one, which was kind of the longest or worst drought on record. And we're in our second dry year here, and hopefully we have a wet winter next year. But this is something we're going to just be dealing with on an annual basis. I think the other thing that's interesting about California, as you guys I'm sure know, is there really isn't any such thing as a normal year in California. It's we kind of go through these extremes. Drought is, we kind of zigzag and go back and forth between dry and wet. A lot of our policy is targeted to what is a quote unquote normal or average year, but we usually seem to be experiencing a dry or drought or wet year. Our committee is going to look into this. Like I said, we're planning an informational hearing on drought sometime in May, after we get through our first, through April, the policy committee hearings. I don't see a lot of legislative proposals on the horizon right now specific to drought. I think that will change as we get through, as this reality starts to set in more and more for policymakers. But I think again, it's just part of our reality, and I think with the changing hydrology due to climate change, and we're going to have to make some changes, kind of how we store and use and deliver water going forward. Any questions there? If not, I can move on. I think we can come back to that too. Only other thing I was going to say, I was looking at the Northern Sierra. You probably see my note there at the bottom. The Northern Sierra 8 station index. We're about 21 inches to date. We need to get to 39.5 for a quote unquote average year. Seems unlikely we're going to get there, and we're sort of at 52% of normal currently. So that's the snowpack is one of our most important reservoirs for water, and it's it's not as we'd like more, I guess. So along those lines, one legislative proposal that you may or may not have heard about is that my boss has introduced, and I'm working on. I'm helping staff, is AB 1500. It's a climate resilience bond. This is picking up some work that he and others did last year on AB 3256, and it was a bond proposal to fund wildfire prevention, drought preparation, flood protection, coastal resiliency kind of responses to sea level rise, as well as kind of emergency preparedness for climate related disasters around the state. So he worked on that with Assemblymember Mullen, who's from the Bay Area, and others last year. And just due to the challenges of the pandemic and the legislative process being cut short, it just never got across the finish line. So he picked up that work and we brought it back this year. And we'll be working, that will be actually heard in the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee, it looks like April 8th. And we'll be working to move that through the legislative process. If everything goes well, this will go before voters in 2022. Right now it's been planned for November 2022, but it could be played. The legislature could put it on the primary ballot in June 2022. There's also SB 45, which is a kind of companion or parallel proposal in the Senate by Senator Portantino from Los Angeles. There's a lot of overlap. I'd say 2/3 similarities between the two proposals, kind of funding, making investments in various responses to climate change. I think the only other thing to say is, I'm sure you have tracked this, since 2000, the state's passed more than $20 billion in sort of natural resource water bonds that fund a lot of important investments. I think there's some concern. I think in the natural resource sector, our bond service is over $1 billion a year now. So I think there's kind of balancing, prudent fiscal policy with kind of the need to make investments is going to be, needs to be part of the conversation going forward. There's also interest in bond issues in other areas like education, schools, housing. There's a homeless veterans bond. There's an agricultural bond. And then there's also folks in the legislature talking about a significant investment in broadband, which I think particularly due to the pandemic has really come front and center, and the need for us all to have high quality, fast internet. So I don't know how these decisions are way above my pay grade. Is this sort of what proposals advance? How does the legislature and the governor deal with kind of, okay, how much, what's a reasonable amount of debt to take on to fund these critical investments? And I think that'll get worked out through the process as we go, beginning now through the end, through September.
So Pablo, this is this is Gary on that bond. How much money is in the bank from previous bonds that hasn't been spent yet? That came up front and center last year, when the bonds or the water bonds were proposed. So where are we at in terms of that equation?
Yeah, good question. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, and I should. But yeah, the legislature and the voters just approved Proposition 68, as you probably remember, in June of 2018. And that was just shy of, I think, $5 billion for some of these same things, parks and open space investments. There's some water investments in there. So I know some of the programs are already spent. Like there was a parks, one of the large investments there was, I think it was $900 million for what's called the statewide parks program to fund parks and park poor communities. They just went out. Actually, the deadline for the last round of funding is this week for that program. So that $900 million is close to being spent down. I'd have to look across the other programs. I need to do, I need to have that information off the top of my head, but I think I'd say 3/4 or more of the money has been spent or committed at least. So I think by the time, if this moves, we're talking and is put before voters in 2022, I think maybe upwards of 90% of the funds from Prop 68 will be spent. Of course, there's also Proposition 1 from 2014. They've committed a lot of money, but some of that money still needs to be spent. One of the largest features of that proposal was the storage program, and they did awards a few years ago for that. But those projects take many years to get through and complete. And so I don't think, while a lot of that money, that $2.7 billion has been committed, I don't think very much of it has actually been spent yet, because those projects are still going through planning, environmental review, and those kinds of things. But yeah, I think it probably feels like a bit of deja vu, right? I'm sure that's one of the issues with bond proposals. Like, hey, didn't we just do this? And Proposition 3 was also put on the ballot, and by it was a citizens initiative in fall 2018 that failed. So I think there was some of that. People describe bond fatigue. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jody London. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Contra Costa County. And in my spare time for the last 12 years, I was on the Oakland School Board where I live. And I have a lot of ideas for you about how you can incorporate schools into the bond. I think there's a lot of opportunities to use bond funds to help schools be more climate resilient, to help them build out green schoolyards, to help set them up to be community resilience centers with solar and energy storage and other things like that. And I would be happy to talk about it with you more if you're interested. But I think incorporating some of that into the bond might also help with voter support, because I think there's a huge amount of recognition in this moment from voters about how important it is for kids to be able to go to school. So I'm happy to share more information if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. I'll take you up on that. we do have, there is funding in the proposal for resilience center, quote unquote resilience centers. I think that needs to be defined better, but yeah, I think always interested in good ideas.
Yeah, and I've been working with the California School Boards Association. I helped them, one of my last things I did in my final year was form a climate committee and start to think more about schools as investing in the actual infrastructure of schools. As a, usually people just want to go right to the curriculum, and I agree that schools are underfunded. There's no doubt there, but I think that fixing the facilities helps a lot as well.
Great, thank you. Gary, I just saw your question on the Delta. Yeah, I'm tracking it. I see Jose from East Bay Mud here is on the call too. And we sat through a lot of meetings on the voluntary agreement. In my prior job, I kind of joked that I had become a professional meeting goer because I felt like I just spent hours and hours in these meetings on the voluntary agreement. Right now, we're tracking it. I don't think the legislature has, I don't mean to sound like a cop-out, but I don't think they really have a role right now in trying to figure out how this all shakes out. I think we're paying attention. We've heard rumblings. I think the Biden administration is going to reverse course on or do something, kind of change the biops that the Trump administration proposed. But I know there's also pending litigation on that. So I think we're sort of waiting to see what the new federal administration does. There's also the state has its incidental take permit. So I think there's a need to just at least synchronize the two. So the feds, the last few years is the first time ever that the feds and the state had different proposed rules. So I think at a minimum, there's a need to sort of harmonize how they're operating their respective projects. And I think that's really playing out at an administrative level. And, we're going to track it and see, kind of how it shakes out. And I think it's possible we could do a hearing down the road, but I don't think there's a need for legislation on this. It sort of needs to play out through the administrative channels. And then, I have heard, Secretary Wade Crowfoot and others talk about, Secretary Crowfoot recently was saying at a forum that, they want to get back to the table on the voluntary agreement in the coming months. So we'll see how that goes. But it's a real issue. We need to sort of balance protecting fish and wildlife in the Delta with kind of the needs of, our economy and communities around the state. And so, I think that's going to, the water board has, also delayed its, due to what they've sort of held off from moving forward on the water quality control plan update in the Delta. So I think a lot of these pieces are moving at the administrative level, and we'll track it. It's definitely in the jurisdiction of the committee, but we currently don't have a plan to do something proactively. I think as things start to fall into place, I think we might do a hearing on it and take a deeper look at it. Let's see. Okay, well, happy to come back to the bonds if there's interest, other questions, and certainly, yeah, I should put my contact information here. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you have thoughts or ideas on it. I'll always have to hear that. And we're doing a lot of stakeholder outreach on this right now to kind of get people's feedback on the current proposal. Let's see. Oh, Dan's asking, is there going to be a water bond coalition? Can you elaborate on the question? I think there's various coalitions of NGOs and water agencies that provide input on the bond. Is that what you're referring to, or? Okay, well, okay.
He says, yes, maybe I should ask other water agencies.
Okay.
So it sounds like we're talking about a coalition that would form outside of, obviously, the official state process.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and my boss spoke to the Aqua Legislative Committee last week about the bond. He was on a panel, and maybe some of you were on that, but he was on a panel with the Senate staffer and the director of government relations for the Nature Conservancy, who has historically played a role in these campaigns. Yeah, Aqua is organizing. We're also in touch with the California Municipal Utilities Association, kind of taking their input. So I think a lot of people are organizing kind of their various associations and coalitions to kind of provide input. And then, if it becomes a real, if it actually goes to the ballot, I think people will transition into more of a campaign. All right, I'll move on. So this, you guys have probably been tracking this too, water affordability. I mean, I should have stopped before I jumped in, started going into my presentation. I feel like since January 1st, I've had a number of conversations with people about what are the big water issues and bills kind of in the legislature this year. And honestly, I don't see like a lot of high profile issues or proposals right now, or I didn't in January, and it's still the case. And I'm kind of highlighting a few of the big issues that are playing out. But you sort of talk to my counterpart in the state Senate. It's like, yeah, it doesn't seem like this is a big water policy year, and we were both okay with that, given kind of the challenges of working remotely and whatnot. But that said, water is a perennial issue in California. As I said, there's the drought, there's the bond, and then come to water affordability. There are some proposals in the Senate on this. They're actually SB 222 and SB 223 by Senator Dodd. And kind of, to go, refresh your memories, when we all went on shutdown last year due to COVID, the governor issued an executive order in April, basically preventing water shutoffs for people who fell behind on their water bills. I think there's broad support for that, recognizing the critical need. Water is just essential to our lives anyway, and particularly in a public health crisis, the need to have access to wash our hands and basic sanitation. I think it made a lot of sense. That executive order is still in place today, so coming up on a year. But what happened last summer, and I think the state water board did a survey of water agencies, and their estimate is there's roughly $1 billion now in unpaid water bills in California. And so that starts to become a real problem for our water. That is a real problem for our water agencies. They can only carry that kind of debt for so long. So I think trying to figure out how to balance, it's playing out right now. It's a conversation that's happening in the legislature. How do we balance not shutting people off, so they have water for basic needs, but also ensuring that we're not causing other problems for our infrastructure to make sure we can deliver water safely. It's kind of there's going to start to be a tension here. There's funding in the federal package passed in December, and there's funding in the one that they just passed. I think there was actually more in the December package for water and utilities. I think there's something like $640 million nationally for this to help address this issue. And there's something, I believe there's around $500 million in the package that just passed last week. So let's say nationally, there's roughly $1 billion available. Conservative rough estimate of how much will California get out of that national pot. Probably the ceiling is around 100 million. It might be less. So it's not not hard math. If we have $1 billion hole, and we might get 100 million from the federal government, there's a huge gap, and that needs to be filled and addressed. So part of what the Dodd bill are trying to do is get at one, I think they're trying to get at how do we distribute the funds if we get any federal relief, and then two, how do we deal with customers who are several months behind on their water bill. So that's playing out in real time. Also, of course, Proposition 218 is a real factor, because even if water agencies have sort of surplus ratepayer money, which I'm not sure they do, but they can't subsidize one ratepayer's bill over another, because just issues about the nexus and kind of people paying their fair share. So I think it kind of, that sort of shackles our water agencies and their ability to be flexible with any revenue or resources they have. So this is a big issue that is playing out this year. This is one of the higher profile water issues as I see it. Like I said, a couple bills, and I think there'll likely be action in the budget, through the budget process as well. All that said, this is an issue that doesn't come through our committee, but I just highlight it because we're tracking it, and like I said, if you want to talk about high profile water policy issues, I think this is definitely one of them this year. All right, let's see, moving on. And the last issue I wanted to highlight is groundwater. I think this is less of an issue for your region. I know like Santa Clara Valley is subject to the groundwater law. I'd have to look at the map again to see what, how East Bay is. But groundwater's an important source of supply for us. A little more than a third on average, and it approaches 50% or even more during a drought year. For most of our history, we didn't have a comprehensive regulatory scheme or management scheme for groundwater in the state. That changed during the last drought in 2014. We passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act of 2014. And this required kind of high and medium priority basins in California, which is predominantly in the Central Coast, in the Central Valley, some North Coast basins and some Southern California basins, but to develop plans to achieve, to begin to take action to, correct overdraft or stop overdrafting the aquifers. And they have 20 years, so 20 years to get to sustainable groundwater management. The first plans were due for critically overdrafted basins. Again, that was predominantly the San Joaquin Valley and a couple Central Coast basins, a couple in the Southern California desert as well. Had to turn in the plans last January of 2020. That was one of the first real critical deadlines in the act. And then the remaining basins, kind of in the Sacramento Valley, North Coast, and a few other places, are working on the plans right now, and they're due January 2022. This has been, I worked on Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, as did many people, or SIGMA. It seems like there's been, I don't know, there's different sides to this issue, but I think whatever your perspective is on it, there's some dissatisfaction with the law that, as I've watched kind of follow-up legislation the last 5-6 years, it seemed like the only things that have been passed has been proposals that really where there's consensus around it across the various stakeholders, whether it's water agencies, environmental groups, agriculture. And I think, but there, it seems to me, and it's not, I don't think it's going to play out this year, but I think in the next couple of years, we'll see probably some reopening or, revisiting SIGMA. But there's been a virtual detente, or sort of an unofficial detente on kind of changes to the law. Again, I don't know, just looking in my crystal ball, I could see people trying to revisit that more forcefully in the coming years. I think as the next, the Department of Water Resources is on point to review the plans that were submitted last year, and we expect, have to make a determination. Is it adequate, inadequate, incomplete? They're supposed to start issuing those determinations on the first set of plans that came in last January, like any week now. This spring is kind of what we're hearing. We're going to start to see, and depending on how that goes, I think people in the legislators will start to really pay attention to this again. If they have water agencies that are, if their plans are deemed inadequate or whatnot, I think this will really pique interest. Also, as if we're heading, I think we're likely heading into official drought. this is, groundwater management is a really critical piece of drought response and drought preparation. So I think the interest in this topic, I guess, to just flag it, because I don't see a lot of proposals on groundwater right now, legislative proposals, but I think in the coming years there's going to be a lot of focus on this, and I think there will be attempts to change SGMA and do other things. Let's see. So that's my slides. Hopefully, thank you for the invitation. Hopefully, you're not experiencing what, based on my presentation, you're not experiencing what the comic strip shows. And happy to, take any questions or, talk about anything I missed.
Thank you, Pablo. I think there was a question that come in kind of early on, just asking if you had any information about the future of the Delta Tunnels project, cap and trade program, high-speed rail, some of these kind of major things that have occurred over the last few years. If you have any information on any of that, that'd be great, or just kind of where you see those projects currently. Obviously, we can take those one at a time because I know all three of them are large. But just to go back, it was the Delta Tunnels, cap and trade, and high-speed rail.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I sort of consciously avoided the Delta Tunnels on my presentation, but
You can't do that. You're in Contra Costa County.
I know.
And we are actually developing a groundwater management plan for the east part of the county.
Okay, great. Well, it's funny. I don't think I could tell you the latest on the Delta. I mean, it's sort of like, I was talking to someone recently and it's like, where is that? I think, look, I'll say this. Governor Brown is probably the strongest advocate for the tunnels we're ever going to see. And he expended a lot of resources and political capital trying to move the project forward during his 8 years. And, it's a multi-decade project. So it's not, he was never going to finish it during his 8 years. But I think he ran into a lot of headwinds. And then Governor Newsom came in and sort of said in his first State of the State, we're going to go from twin tunnels to single tunnel, which is just sort of like, I don't know. I mean, okay, what's the capacity? I sort of like, okay, maybe go, okay. Doesn't necessarily mean it's less or, what's the capacity of that tunnel, So it's sort of, I think he kind of threaded the political needle he needed to on that. And I don't really detect them really pushing the project forward. I think it's sort of in some version of environmental planning or review, right? I wouldn't say it's a review, it's some environmental planning. Maybe someone on the call that has can explain to me where it is better than I can, but it's certainly not really on the radar in the legislature. I mean, I think there's the known kind of, people kind of have their perspective on it, pro or against, and it's sort of, it feels kind of entrenched. I know when they did the environmental document for the water fix, there was like, at some count, I counted up to like 30 lawsuits at one point, and then I lost track of it. But I know a lot of those lawsuits got consolidated, and I don't even know what the status is. So it's sort of a question mark for me too. I don't think it's moving forward quickly, I guess it's safe to say. And I have questions about the future of it, whether you're for it or against it, because I think, like I said, can't imagine someone being a stronger advocate for the project than Governor Jerry Brown. He's not there, obviously. So if someone can respond to that or tell me they might be tracking it more closely than me.
Hey, Pablo, this is Jose. I actually add just a little bit more. There's a parallel track going on right now, both with the EIS, EIR, Army Corps, doing the EIS basically focused on the construction aspects. One thing that has not been developed yet has been the operational criteria or planning for just operations for the project. I believe the expectation is those will be on the streets sometime at the very end of this year or in 2022. And as of today, the federal component, they're not participating. The Bureau is not participating in the project. So right now it's a California only project, but there's still room. My understanding is there's still room for them to decide to join the project at some point in the future. So that's the other part of my life between water quality control plan and Delta Advance.
Two small issues.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah. So I think that's my take is if that project ever gets built, the tunnel ever gets built, it's many years out, if not a couple of decades. Cap and trade you asked about. So I haven't, they think cap and trade was a real lifeline to the high-speed rail project. I don't track high-speed rail that closely, so I don't think I can give you the ins and outs of it. I mean, I think it was on until there was a deal cut in the first year of the cap and trade, greenhouse gas reduction fund, to have a continuous appropriation to the high-speed rail project, and that I don't think if that hadn't happened, I think the project would have folded or collapsed. But since they've had that, I think it's $300 or $400 million a year is what it's been getting from the cap and trade program, and they continue to move it forward. I know there's a hearing on it in the transportation committee in the last month. I don't have a good sense of where it is, but it's still getting that money on an annual basis from the cap and trade program. One of the issues with that source of funding, one, there's a lot of demands on it, but when the pandemic hit last spring, they have quarterly auctions under the cap and trade program. They sell these allowances, and it's the revenue generated from that goes towards these programs, and it's generated roughly $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year that can be spent. But the May auction last year was a disaster. I mean, it generated, usually those things, so they generate 400 to 500 million per auction, and I think it generated like less than 50 million, and because there's just all this uncertainty in the economy, and there wasn't a demand for those allowances because businesses and regulated entities didn't really know what the future looked like. But by the August auction, things had recovered, and the demand for those allowances for the cap and trade program, was there, and they had a pretty robust sale. So the revenue, I guess I'll have to say the revenue is there, and I think seems pretty stable, and it will continue to fund high-speed rail and some of these other things. There's also an allocation to wildfire prevention. They cut a deal on SB 200, and I guess it was in 2019 for safe and affordable drinking water. So it takes about 100 million out of the cap and trade funds every year for that purpose.
You're making a good case for the state to continue cap and trade, because I know I've seen a couple of articles saying that cap and trade isn't the right way to get at this, and it's inequitable and things like that. So I was curious about kind of the politics of eliminating cap and trade, or somehow doing it differently. I don't have an opinion either way. I just
yeah. Well, I think but it's extended through 2030, so I think we have another close to a decade. Right. And that was one of the big fights or big issues Governor Brown took on, and my boss was actually in the middle of that. And so I think California, is committed to that program, and there's discussion about doing something nationally now. And I think I've never seen a presidential candidate talk about climate change the way Joe Biden did. It's the first time. I remember in 2008, we're putting on my Enviro hat, and it's like, don't say the words climate change. You don't want to even talk about it. It was really off-putting, but we just come in California, and as well as nationally, we just come so far in terms of our understanding, or at least realization, that this is really happening. And there's still holdouts out there, but just because of what we experienced, it's real front and center for all of us. I mean, I think like last summer was just crazy, the wildfire smoke, and you look at these maps of the plume of smoke over basically the whole West Coast. So I think that will continue to be there. Of course, if we're successful with the program, there won't be any revenue in the end, right? That's the whole point.
Right.
So if we're funding these commitments, I mean, there's an argument there of we're gonna someday have to find a better way to pay for these programs, right? And that reckoning will come sooner, eventually. If we, particularly if we meet our climate reduction, greenhouse gas reduction goals. What was the third thing, Lindy? I forgot, or is it in my?
I think you kind of touched it. Was high-speed rail was kind of
okay.
The third one, and I think you kind of touched on that a little bit. So thank you for giving us a little bit of what you know about those projects. I know that high-speed rail, just so that everyone on this call is aware, is something that we've paid a little bit of attention to with our transportation infrastructure folks, because there is continual conversations about high-speed rail and how it might interact with Valley Link, which is a proposal for some access between San Joaquin and like the Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin area, Tri-Valley. So if anyone's interested, happy to share a little bit more information about that. It's not really at a development stage, more just in the kind of business plan. What does this look like in the future kind of questions. I know that Bob Whitley has his hand raised. So Bob, do you want to chime in and ask your question yourself?
Yes. So thank you for the presentation. It's always good to hear what the current thinking is. And I'm particularly appreciative of the linkage between what you presented about bond measure and affordability. And one of the underlying issues that have recognized now is what's happening into poor communities, whether they're clusters or whether they're pockets, whether they're part of an urban water system or whether they're on wells. And the issue is these poor communities may not be able to afford safe drinking water. And that's particularly evident in certain parts of the valleys, whether it's Central Valley or Salinas Valley. And yet, as the argument goes, we as a state should be making sure that there is safe drinking water for our citizens. But that takes money. And bond measures are typically for capital improvements, but doesn't touch the basic question about ongoing obligations for operation and maintenance, which gets back to the affordability question. So maybe in your dialogue, as you connect those two, how does the state view what we can do to help these poor communities throughout the state?
Yeah, thanks for the comment. I mean, I think I agree. I think of that issue, the O&M, which doesn't get people that excited, but it's like so critically important. I think of it as stewardship. It's a big problem. I mean, that was what the SB 200 from 2019 was trying to take on, is how do we, particularly focusing on small community water systems, how do we give them the funding to do the maintenance and operations and maintenance? The state has proven very successful at passing the bond measures, but that, as you said, that's for capital outlay for kind of longer term infrastructure investments. You're not supposed to use that, and I don't think it's good fiscal policy to use those funds for hiring staff year in and year out. So it's just been, but part of why the bond, it's just politically, it's easier to pass a bond. It's a lot harder to get those ongoing funding sources. And I think when I was at the Nature Conservancy, they worked on, you may remember Proposition 21 in 2010, which was the Parks Pass. It was a $18 fee on your vehicle license fee, on your car registration, and the funding was going to go to the state parks and because they had like a $2 billion, remember in the Schwarzenegger era, he proposed, and I think he actually did follow through on shutting down some parks. And they had this $2 billion backlog maintenance problem. So that, the Parks Pass was trying to get at that issue. And it also provided some money for the Department of Fish and Wildlife to manage their natural areas. And that failed at the ballot box. So I think there's a recognition of a need to find that ongoing funding, generally talking about raising taxes in some fashion, taxes or fees, and that has just been politically challenging. I know there's been a discussion about Proposition 218 reform. I think a lot of the water agency community and I think a lot of the environmental and geo communities interested in that, but that also is just very politically challenging to get done. And you really have to, it's a constitutional amendment. You have to go back to the voters. So I think it's difficult. I think some successes there when I forget the proposition, but when California legalized cannabis a few years ago, some of the sales tax, the revenue generated from that, the sales of that is dedicated to the Parks Department and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that helped give them some annual funding. And then also when the legislature and Governor Brown worked on SB1, the gas tax, I think that was 2016, they dedicated a portion of the revenue to the State Parks Department as well. So I think State Parks is doing better than it was. But, that was sort of creative, maybe more under the radar, but trying to get at our water infrastructure and managing these spaces, it's a challenge. Department of Fish and Wildlife is really struggling. They have a kind of perennial deficit of 60 to 100 million, depending on who you ask. And that makes it harder for them to issue the permits they need to do for projects. It makes it harder for them to manage the lands they have and carry out their responsibilities. So, I hear you. I don't have the solution. And I think we have to, as we talk about bonds, we have to think about if we're going to make these investments, we want to make sure we can take care of these things for the long run.
Thank you, Pablo. Gary has his hand raised as well. Gary, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Lindy. So Pablo, we are an association, an organization that's large in the East Bay. Are there things that you're doing that you would like to hear from us, either support-wise or provide input? And I guess while I've got the screen here for a second, how far along is the bond? Can we, to the two bonds in the Senate and we provide, it actually would make a difference, or really set now and it's going to have its own path forward?
Thanks for that. We welcome input on both. Well, I can speak for AB 1500. Definitely welcome your input and encourage your engagement. It's not too late. We're early in the process. We're just getting going. I think it's a good proposal out of the gates. I'm biased because I helped write some of it, but I think there's a long road ahead of us, and I think as the first policy committee hearing will be in the committee, Water, Parks and Wildlife Committee, on April 8th, and I think it's likely to be changed or amended sometime in April or May. So definitely, in the next, between now and the end of the month of March is a great time to look at it and to offer comments. And we've been talking to a lot of different folks. We kind of the team staffing it. Like I said, we were in front of Aqua last week. I'm talking to a representative of the California Municipal Utilities Association this week and others. So this is a great time to provide input. And I'm not, involved in staffing SB 45, but I think they're in a similar boat. They reintroduced the proposal they had in 2020, but I know they're taking a lot of input. So I think there's that now is a good time to weigh in and identify priorities for your region, and to let both both side, both the authors or leader, staff on both proposals let them know what you think. It's also would be helpful to reach out to your elected officials, your assembly members and senators, and get them invested in asking for the priorities you have. I feel like at the staff level we can make policy changes to the language. It's a lot harder for us to add or subtract money. It's going to get to the point where your officials and your electeds have much greater ability to get funding for a particular program. So yeah.
Good. Can you provide your contact information to us?
Yeah, I'll type it in the chat. I should have put it on my presentation.
Okay, thanks. Maybe others have other questions.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'm not seeing another hand raised, and we have some comments in the chat, but not questions. I had a quick one, Pablo. I'm just curious, as you guys have been talking about this AB 1500 and where those funds might go to or come from, has there been any discussion about EVs and any funding coming towards EVs from this? Or I know the governor has identified other pockets of money and had a lot of those conversations, but I'm just curious if those conversations are kind of coming into this conversation or if they've been kept pretty separate.
Yeah, it was definitely part of the discussion last year in 2020. And there was a proposed language for the predecessor to AB 1500, AB 3256, which my boss introduced last year, that would have had funding for EV charging infrastructure and for medium and heavy duty truck conversion. That kind of got dropped out, and that was driven by a few Southern California legislators who wanted that in the bond. So I think it's there, and people are talking about it. I think historically, it'd be a new thing for the water kind of resource bonds, but it doesn't mean it's not a good thing, to include in the bond by any stretch. And the governor has a really, his executive order in the fall that gets, I think it's by 2035, kind of all EV. So I think, and he's dedicated, I think upwards of $1 billion in the state budget to help achieve that goal. So I think that helps. I think that kind of helps shift the conversation away from the bond to kind of the budget, but it's certainly a conversation that was occurring last year, and I think people are talking about it again this year. Like, is there some investment that needs to happen through a bond to sort of help the state meet its goals in that space? So it's not in either proposal right now, but I've heard from different groups that they want some of those investments in, and we'll sort of have to work through the legislative process and see if that ends up in it. I'd say it's 50-50. I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
And Judy just put some stuff about some of the EV efforts that are happening here locally. So thanks for putting that in there,
Yeah.
Judy. And thanks for being here. I think that probably wraps up the majority of our questions. I'm not seeing anyone else raising their hands or anyone putting anything in the chat. But I really appreciate you being here and coming to speak to the East Bay Leadership Council and giving us a little bit of information about what's happening. We'll certainly be paying close attention to those bonds in particular. And please feel free to reach out to us if there's anything else that kind of crosses your desk that you were looking for feedback on or might be particularly of interest. Gary, Dan, George, is there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
I would just echo Pablo. Thank you so much for sharing with us what's on the agenda there and at the state level. And you may be hearing from some of us. So thank you for providing your contact information. And thank you all for participating today. We continue to have these Zoom meetings that I'm tired of, so I'm looking forward to getting back together. But next month, George is bringing in speakers related to Bay Area dredging, and that should be very informative. And it's, you can anticipate some people, it's controversial, but it is something that happens in our Bay, and so I'm looking forward to that presentation on April 20th. So that I have. George, anything else?
No, I just wanted to thank Pablo and And I'm going to mention on the dredging presentation, Stu Townsend from the Corps of Engineers will be speaking. And he's a deputy district engineer. And one of the main topics will be beneficial reuse from the dredging spoils. So I think that'll be of interest to all of us. But thanks again to Pablo. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak to you all. Sorry for the IT challenges up front, but
It happens. Thanks so much, Pablo.
yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Pablo, good to see you.
Bye-bye.